Yesterday, a dry, 6-page regulatory notice from the Department of Finance landed on my desk, and it contains the most aggressive economic countermeasure Canada has deployed against the United States automotive sector since the signing of the 1965 Auto Pact. Official Ottawa is calling it a routine administrative adjustment under the new auto diminishment framework. Do not believe the surface-level narrative. What we are watching unfold tonight is a calculated industrial execution. The message directed at General Motors inside the Renaissance Centre in Detroit could not be clearer. You accepted billions in Canadian taxpayer subsidies. You broke your structural employment promises in Ontario, and now the hammer has fallen. This is not a standard trade dispute, it is not a routine diplomatic snub, and it is not a negotiating tactic gone wrong. This is a full-scale institutional crisis engineered by Ottawa with surgical precision. It has left Detroit automotive executives reeling, Canadian manufacturing workers watching in disbelief, and the entire future of integrated North American supply chains hanging in the balance. What began as a quiet, unilateral corporate decision in an executive boardroom has spiraled into an international economic confrontation. The official narrative tells us that multinational corporations hold all the cards, that they can play jurisdictions off one another, extract billions in green transition subsidies, and then walk away when the quarterly global spreadsheet blinks red. For decades, that narrative was true. But on October 23, 2025, the Canadians decided to rewrite the rulebook of continental trade. The instrument of this enforcement was not a fiery speech at the United Nations or a symbolic diplomatic protest. It was a cold, legally precise reallocation of tariff quotas that effectively slaps a 25% financial penalty on every single US-built General Motors vehicle crossing the border into the Canadian market. Overnight, the economic calculations that dictate North American automotive manufacturing completely shattered. Make sure you are subscribed to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis like this. And hit that like button as we pull back the curtain on this high-stakes confrontation to understand the sheer scale of the shockwave hitting Detroit. We have to look closely at the chronological sequence of events. This was a multi-stage trap, and General Motors walked directly into it. Here is the timeline to keep things clear. The groundwork was laid back in 2022. That was the year of the grand political podium announcements. The federal government and the province of Ontario poured $518 million Canadian dollars directly into modernising the Cami assembly plant in Ingersoll, Ontario. The objective was specific: transform the facility into Canada's first large-scale, dedicated electric vehicle manufacturing hub. The centrepiece of this grand bargain was the Bright Drop electric delivery van. This was not a minor pilot project or a side venture. It was marketed to the Canadian public as a long-term economic anchor, a guaranteed job creator, and the ultimate proof that Canadian hands would build the zero-emission commercial fleets of tomorrow. General Motors accepted every single dollar, absorbed every tax credit, and signed the legally binding investment frameworks. For 3 years, workers retooled, retrained, and staked their entire livelihoods on that explicit corporate promise. Then came October 2025. Citing soft global demand for electric commercial vehicles, General Motors abruptly pulled the plug. Initially, the company termed it a temporary suspension, a minor operational pause. Production lines froze. More than 200 manufacturing workers, the economic bedrock of Ingersoll, a town of just 14,000 people, were left sitting in limbo. They waited for text messages, emails, or any formal notification from Detroit. None came. Weeks of deafening corporate silence followed. Then, the final betrayal occurred in early April 2026. General Motors blindsided Ottawa by converting that temporary pause into a permanent teardown announcement. The plant was done. The jobs were gone. Corporate leadership in Detroit reportedly expected the standard Canadian response. A few angry editorials in the national press, a sternly worded letter from the Ontario Premier, and perhaps a polite request for a bilateral meeting. They assumed Canada would ultimately fold, just as it had done during the deindustrialization waves of the late 20th century. They could not have been more wrong. What happened exactly 72 hours after GM's permanent closure announcement has completely disrupted the history of Canada-US auto relations. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly and Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne did not issue a diplomatic note. Instead, they triggered an automated legislative trap that had been quietly woven into Canadian trade policy earlier that year. The Auto Diminishment Framework. The name sounds like dry, bureaucratic jargon, but in practice, it operates as a financial guillotine. Under this framework, any foreign automaker operating in Canada must maintain active local production, retain specific domestic employment levels, and fully execute its capitalisation promises. If they fulfil their word, their vehicles enter Canada duty-free. If they violate their commitments, their preferential tariff quotas are stripped automatically. On October 23, 2025, the framework claimed its first targets. The federal government slashed General Motors' duty-free import quota by exactly 24.2%. Concurrently, Stellantis, which had quietly shifted its high-margin Jeep production lines from Canadian facilities to Belvidere, Illinois, was hit even harder, losing up to 50% of its tariff-free export privileges. Let the strategic math of that move sink in. A 24.2% reduction in duty-free quotas means that nearly a quarter of all US-built General Motors vehicles destined for Canadian consumers now face an immediate 25% customs tariff at the border. The landed cost of high-margin American vehicles, like the Chevrolet Silverado and the Cadillac Escalade, exploded instantly. A vehicle costing $45,000 to assemble suddenly crossed the border with an $11,000 penalty attached. For GM's Canadian dealership networks, profit margins vanished overnight. Vehicles sitting on dealer lots from Windsor to Toronto became instantly unsellable at competitive market rates. This is the brilliant simplicity of economic statecraft when it is backed by structural leverage. Ottawa did not launch an emotional PR campaign. They targeted the corporate bottom line where it inflicts maximum pain. While European and Asian automotive competitors continue to access the Canadian market under standard, predictable trade terms, American-made GM products are now saddled with punitive duties because their parent company treated a sovereign government contract as a soft suggestion. The panic inside the corporate offices of the Renaissance Centre is palpable, and it is spreading across the American Midwest. Supply chain managers in Michigan, Ohio, and Pennsylvania are currently staring at paralyzed regional sales targets. Their Canadian inventory is piling up, and Canadian buyers are actively walking away from GM showrooms to purchase non-tariffed alternatives from Toyota and Hyundai. The strategic brilliance of Joly's execution lies in its cold, legal finality. Following the quota reduction, she issued a direct, unyielding ultimatum to General Motors and Stellantis. The corporate leadership has exactly 15 days to present a fully capitalized, verifiable production plan for a new vehicle line at the Ingersoll plant. Not a vague corporate memo, not a polished PR statement, but a binding contract complete with hard timelines and strict resource allocations. If they comply, the tariff quotas will be restored. If they refuse, the 25% penalty becomes permanent. This is how a mid-sized trading partner completely upends the traditional balance of power. For decades, multinational corporations held an absolute veto over Canadian labour. The corporate playbook was repetitive and effective. Accept lower wages, accept fewer benefits, and accept massive public subsidies, or we will pack up our tooling and move production to Mexico or the American South. This structural intimidation worked because Canadian governments historically pleaded rather than enforced. But this morning, the entire Continental calculus has flipped. With each passing day that the Auto Diminishment Framework remains active, General Motors loses millions of dollars in highly lucrative market share. The financial reality is brutal. Restarting the assembly lines at the CAMI plant in Ingersoll has suddenly become significantly cheaper for GM than absorbing a permanent 25% tariff across its entire US manufactured export lineup. The ripples of this Canadian geopolitical assertivines are already forcing a massive realignment across the entire global manufacturing landscape. This is a profound shift in how Canada views its national autonomy and its economic sovereignty. The state is no longer acting as Detroit's passive economic backyard. By building robust domestic policy tools proactively and pairing them with aggressive procurement strategies, Ottawa is signalling to every global conglomerate from Tokyo to Berlin that Canada will no longer tolerate being taken for granted. Corporate E. entities like Boeing, Intel, and global pharmaceutical giants who have historically absorbed Canadian infrastructure subsidies are suddenly re-examining their own domestic employment contracts. They now see a sovereign state that actually enforces its legal frameworks. Within just 3 weeks of the tariff activation, the corporate behaviour has shifted dramatically. Ford Motor Company has quietly paused its planned production relocations. Stellantis has abruptly replaced its top Canadian executive in a desperate bid to reset diplomatic relations with Ottawa. And General Motors has formally requested an emergency closed-door meeting with provincial and federal officials. The leverage has shifted entirely to the workers, proving that a government can successfully dictate terms to transnational capital if it possesses the institutional courage to drop the hammer. The 15-day deadline is ticking down, and Detroit is scrambling because it has realised it has no backup plan. The lines are drawn, the trap has sprung, and the Canadian government has proven it can match corporate ruthlessness with sovereign power. But as the executives in the Renaissance Centre calculate their survival strategies, the most consequential question remains completely unanswered. That unanswered question cuts straight to the core of Continental trade. How did a mid-sized trading partner manage to construct a legal trap so airtight that it completely neutralised the leverage of a century-old industrial titan? The answer is not found in political rhetoric or public grandstanding. It is buried deep within the technical architecture of the agreement that General Motors signed back in 2022. A cross-jurisdictional financial blueprint that Ottawa and Queen's Park designed from day one to operate as a binding economic contract, to dare stand why Detroit's legal teams are currently paralysed. We have to strip away the corporate public relations veneer and perform a forensic dissection on the specific deal architecture. This was not a loose handshake agreement or a vague memorandum of understanding. This was a multi-layered, state-backed capitalisation framework tied directly to Canada's Customs Tariff Act. When General Motors accepted 518 million Canadian dollars in joint public funding to transform the Cami assembly plant in Ingersoll into an electric vehicle hub, they did not just accept a cash injection. They signed on to a highly conditional, legally enforceable asset reclassification scheme. When you look closely at the mechanical components of this deal, 3 distinct structural pillars emerge. Each one was engineered to prevent exactly the kind of corporate flight we witnessed when GM attempted its permanent teardown announcement. First, the deal architecture fundamentally decoupled the subsidies from simple infrastructure deployment and tied them directly to rolling, audited employment thresholds. Historically, automotive bailouts and modernisation grants were front-loaded. A company received the capital, built the clean room facility, installed the advanced robotics, and fulfilled its legal obligations the moment the ribbon was cut. The 2022 Cami agreement completely inverted this dynamic. The $518 million was structured as a 10-year forgivable loan, distributed in tranches, where forgiveness is contingent on maintaining a baseline of no fewer than 1,200 full-time manufacturing positions operating on active production shifts. The moment General Motors idled the line and issued its termination notices, the remaining unamortized tranches of that public capital instantly converted into an active interest-bearing debt obligation payable to the Crown. Second, the structural masterstroke of this arrangement lies in its integration with Canada's harmonised tariff schedule and the specific allocation of tariff rate quotas, or TRQs. Under Continental trading rules, automakers rely heavily on specialised duty-free import exemptions to move high-margin, heavy-duty trucks and luxury sport utility vehicles across the border to satisfy Canadian consumer demand. The Canadian government did not try to sue GM in an international court for breach of contract, a process that would take years to resolve. Instead, the Department of Finance utilised domestic regulatory powers to link GM's duty-free import privileges directly to its domestic production output. Under the newly activated Auto Diminishment Framework, an automaker's quota of tariff-free imports is calculated using a strict mathematical ratio based on the total volume of vehicles assembled locally. By dropping its Canadian manufacturing output to zero at the Ingersoll facility, General Motors mechanically triggered a 24.2% reduction in its own import quotas. Third, The deal implemented a joint federal-provincial clawback mechanism with absolute jurisdictional harmony. For decades, multinational corporations successfully exploited the political friction between Ottawa and the provinces. They would play the federal government against provincial leadership, knowing that a dispute over regional labour could be obscured by political finger-pointing. The 2022 deal closed this loophole entirely through a synchronised legal covenant. Finance Minister François-Philippe Champagne and Ontario Premier Doug Ford structured the funding under a unified administrative vehicle. If a breach occurs at the municipal plant level, both the federal corporate tax incentives and the provincial infrastructure grants face simultaneous automated revocation. This synchronised architecture is exactly why Ontario's provincial leadership stood shoulder to shoulder with federal ministers when the quota reductions were announced, completely denying GM the ability to lobby Queen's Park for a separate, softer compromise. The key players in this high-stakes industrial chess match have completely discarded the traditional diplomatic playbook. Industry Minister Mélanie Joly is leading the enforcement strategy not as a standard trade diplomat, but as an aggressive defender of sovereign economic space. By delivering a direct, short and legally unambiguous 15-day ultimatum to GM's global executive team, she effectively bypassed the standard sluggish bureaucratic channels. Her strategy is being reinforced by Unifor National President Lana Payne, who represents the Wine 200 workers at the Kami facility. Unifor's role here is critical. They are providing the real-time operational data from the plant floor that allows the federal government to verify exactly when and how GM breached its production targets. On the other side of the ledger sits GM's executive leadership in Detroit, a corporate hierarchy that has spent decades operating under the assumption that public subsidies are essentially free money with zero structural strings attached. They calculated that the financial hit of walking away from the electric delivery van market in Canada would be negligible compared to the cost of maintaining an underutilised assembly line. They completely failed to model the secondary and tertiary damage that a 25% retaliatory tariff would inflict on their core, high-profit combustion engine segments. The financial terms of this confrontation are devastatingly clear, and they prove that abstract power shifts become concrete when backed by specific numbers. General Motors depends on the Canadian market to absorb hundreds of thousands of high-margin vehicles annually. By slashing the duty-free quota by 24.2%, Ottawa has ensured that every single Chevrolet Silverado, GMC Sierra, and Cadillac Escalade exceeding that quota cap is hit with an immediate 25% customs penalty. Consider the raw economic impact on a standard US-built heavy-duty pickup truck. If the manufacturing and logistics cost of that vehicle is $50,000, the auto diminishment framework instantly adds a $12,500 tariff penalty the second it reaches the border. In the automotive retail sector, where dealer margins on premium vehicles typically hover between 5 and 8%, a 25% penalty is fatal. General Motors cannot absorb that cost internally without destroying its corporate profitability, nor can it pass that massive price hike onto Canadian consumers who can easily walk across the street to buy an untariffed competitor. Subscribe to Canada SR for clear, fact-driven analysis if you want to see exactly how these technical trade mechanisms are shifting power back to domestic economies. This is a masterclass in applying targeted financial leverage. Ottawa did not impose broad, scattershot tariffs on the entire American auto sector, which would have triggered immediate American political retaliation under Continental trade agreements. Instead, they designed a legally precise, company-specific quota reallocation that penalises only the specific corporate bad actors who violated their domestic investment covenants. It is a highly localised, surgical economic strike that leaves Washington with almost no viable grounds for a formal trade challenge. Because Canada is simply enforcing the domestic production criteria that GM voluntarily signed on to, in exchange for $500 million in public capital. What this means for the broader landscape of North American manufacturing is a complete rewriting of corporate risk assessment. For the past 30 years, the prevailing logic of globalization dictated that capital was entirely fluid while labor was permanently fixed. Corporations believed they could demand endless financial concessions from sovereign states, exploit local infrastructure, and then pivot their supply chains to lower-cost jurisdictions the moment consumer trends fluctuated. Today, that entire corporate playbook is obsolete. The Canadian state has demonstrated that it possesses the regulatory infrastructure and the political will to convert access to its lucrative domestic market into a powerful weapon for labour enforcement. The financial calculations made in corporate boardrooms must now factor in a brand new variable: the true structural cost of breaking a promise to a sovereign trading partner. The immediate, panicky restructuring we are witnessing inside Stellantis and the urgent, closed-door meetings requested by General Motors prove that the financial penalty of living under the auto diminishment framework is far more expensive than simply keeping their promises and maintaining active manufacturing operations on Canadian soil. Ottawa has effectively proved that economic sovereignty is not an abstract historical concept. It is a functional policy tool that can be wielded with devastating precision when a government stops begging for corporate investment and begins aggressively enforcing its legal contracts. But as the 15-day countdown clock continues to tick down in real time, a much deeper, more volatile structural crisis is beginning to manifest along the highly integrated border crossings of the Detroit-Windsor corridor. By shifting the financial penalty of broken manufacturing promises directly onto Detroit's bottom line, Ottawa has effectively weaponized access to its domestic consumer market, fundamentally upending the historical power dynamics of continental trade. The technical architecture of the auto diminishment framework did not just trap General Motors, it established a permanent regulatory precedent. What began as a highly localized labour dispute in Ingersoll, Ontario, has transformed into a profound structural declaration of Canadian industrial sovereignty. When you zoom out from the assembly lines of the Kami plant, the broader strategic implications of this policy shift reveal a significant structural pivot in Canada-US relations. For over 3 decades, the prevailing geopolitical assumption was that North American manufacturing operated under a borderless, friction-free continental integration. That assumption is officially dead. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Mark Carney's government, Ottawa is explicitly demonstrating that it will no longer allow the Canadian economy to function as a passive, unhedged buffer for the shifting corporate priorities of Detroit or the volatile legislative shifts of Washington. By decoupling its regulatory framework from standard diplomatic pleading and tying it directly to automated customs penalties, Canada has introduced a hard sovereign boundary into the heart of the integrated supply chains. This is a fundamental departure from the pre-Trump era of trade diplomacy. Throughout the original NAFTA period, Canadian trade policy was defined by a predictable, almost dogmatic reliance on multilateral rules, institutional arbitration panels, and polite, rules-based lobbying. If an American corporation violated an agreement, or if Washington enacted protectionist measures, Ottawa's default playbook was to launch a decade-long dispute resolution process through the World Trade Organization or regional panels, quietly absorbing the domestic industrial losses in the interim. Today, that passive playbook has been permanently discarded. Having navigated multiple waves of aggressive, non-standard US tariff pressures including universal steel, aluminum, and manufacturing surtaxes, the Canadian state has built an entirely different, self-executing retaliatory infrastructure. The new model relies on asymmetric, domestic regulatory leverage that can be deployed within 72 hours of a corporate breach, completely bypassing the sluggish and politicized international courts. This is not a defensive reaction, it is a calculated imitation of aggressive economic statecraft, turned back on the very empire that pioneered it. The strategic ripples of this policy reach far beyond the automotive sector, signalling a comprehensive realignment across Canada's critical macroeconomic pillars, most notably energy, defence procurement, and global trade diversification. In the energy sector, the message to Washington is unambiguous. Continental access to Canada's vast critical minerals, hydroelectric networks, and transition infrastructure is no longer a guaranteed frictionless right. If multinational conglomerates expect to secure long-term, stable access to northern resources, they must match those extraction plans with permanent, highly capitalized downstream domestic processing and manufacturing jobs, in terms of defense procurement and advanced technology. This aggressive state intervention is already serving as a powerful warning shot to major aerospace and industrial primes like Boeing and Intel. The era of taking multi-billion-dollar Canadian procurement subsidies and green transition grants while quietly outsourcing the actual high-value engineering and assembly work back to the American Midwest is officially over. Ottawa has proven it possesses the mechanical tools and the political stomach to claw back fiscal privileges and impose punitive economic boundaries the moment a corporate entity falls out of compliance with its domestic investment covenants. Concurrently, this sharp continental friction is accelerating Canada's broader long-term trade diversification strategy. By establishing firm, predictable boundaries for American manufacturing, Ottawa is deliberately positioning itself to court non-continental capital. The recent restructuring of import frameworks, including the highly strategic, tightly calibrated annual quota systems designed for alternative global automotive manufacturers, proves that Canada is actively seeking to reduce its near-total industrial dependence on the United States. Mexico Business News. The strategy sends a crystalline message to global boardrooms from Tokyo to Berlin. If you come to Canada, invest heavily in its domestic workforce and respect its sovereign legal frameworks, you will be rewarded with a stable, highly educated and legally protected manufacturing base. If you treat the country as a secondary branch plant economy, whose operations can be liquidated via a corporate email, the financial consequences will be swift, automated, and devastating to your global margins. Global enterprises are realizing that Canada is transforming itself into a rare jurisdiction in the modern global economy, a state that paired regulatory stability with hard, unyielding accountability. This bold exercise in industrial statecraft has successfully forced the world's largest automotive conglomerates to halt their planned capital flights, reset their executive leadership, and scramble back to the negotiating table in Ottawa. By transforming a dry customs remission order into a razor-sharp tool for labour enforcement, Canada has demonstrated that a mid-sized trading partner can successfully neutralise the structural leverage of transnational capital if it has the institutional courage to enforce its laws. The balance of power along the Detroit-Windsor corridor has shifted. Corporate board